All right, we come to the second half of the letter to third John, not to third John, which again was written by the Apostle John in his older years, and we don't know exactly how old he was, but he was up there in years, somewhere in near 90, if not into his 90s. I lean toward an earlier age for him, late 80s, but most people say he was 90 and above. I don't know. Nobody really knows. It doesn't matter. But we come to the second half of the letter, and he wrote this particular letter to Gaius. Gaius, who is well beloved, which I illustrated yesterday, just as many of our brethren are well beloved, people who we care a lot about and think a lot of and respect, admire, and even follow to an extent. There's always been those that we look up to and want to be more like, and so I think of Gaius as one of those. Somebody you would want to be more like, somebody godly and good. And anyway, when we get to, and we're going to pick up in verse 8, but I'm going to back up for context. He was talking about, in verse 5, he says, Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and the strangers. Means you're faithful to everybody, whether it be a stranger or a brother. And they've borne witness of your charity before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. This is, I talked about this yesterday, and the fact that it's not that you can't receive from others, it's just that you have to be careful who you're endorsed by, and certain of the Gentiles, first of all, I don't know why they'd give you anything, but if they did, it'd probably be a bribe, or they'd want to have some say-so in how the money was spent. This is the problem with our whole idea for Congress and politics. It's why people are screaming for term limits. Term limits aren't necessary if we just stop voting the idiots in that do this stuff. But it's always amazed me, on the right or the left, how you get somebody in there who's going in there for a particular job and who has a salary of $100,000 a year, maybe $150,000 a year, and if they had a job already, then they might have a side business or something. But they come out of there multimillionaires, and you can't tell me there's not corruption in that. There's bound to be. So anyway, the reason is when they get in those jobs, they're supported by people, and those people expect them to give a return on the investment. So when he says that for his name's sake, they went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles, it was because their love for the Lord, they didn't want the support of those who didn't really support them, who were only after some of their influence or whatever. So it's just something to be mindful of. But we mentioned it yesterday, so I didn't mean to get back on it. I'm just reading into verse 8 when he says, We, therefore, ought to receive such that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. In other words, try to work with people that you know are sincere, and if you're not sure, then wait and let the Lord show you what to do. Never just jump into any idea with somebody just because you're hoping for their support. Get to know who you're working with and dealing with. To give you an example of that, I've had people, missionaries, who I don't really know who want to be supported by our church. Not here, but in the past. And I don't know them. I don't know much about what they're doing, and sometimes I'm hesitant. That wrinkle in my shirt is bugging me. It's being caused by my undershirt. Promise. Anyway, sorry. I have to look at this camera, so I can't help but see the little things like that. But anyway, I've got a shirt on under this, and it's messing this one up. The idea is that you get to know who it is you're working with in the Lord, and know that they're fellow helpers, and you be fellow helpers to them as they are to you. Here he just says, We therefore ought to receive such that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. Now, what John's talking about here is a reference to those who are giving a good testimony of Gaius. And of the things that they have done by his leadership, and he's just saying we should do likewise. That's all that means. Verse 9, he says, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. In other words, John intended to go and to speak to them directly to help with this battle against Gnosticism. This happens, okay, this happens a lot. Sometimes the reason that there's not more communication among the churches is because somebody wants to be the only one speaking. And listen, there's been times when I was slow about letting somebody else speak. It's not because I want to be the leader or have preeminence. It's because I'm trying to protect the flock, and if I don't know what someone's going to say, I get a little nervous. But if I know who you are and I know where you stand and what you stand for, I don't mind it at all. We've had guest speakers and preachers, and we've had evangelists come in for our revival. We've had missionaries come in and speak, and I don't usually mind. It's just the ones I don't know real well. So anyway, he says, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence, means he wants to be the leader. He wants to be the most important guy. Among them receiveth us not. He didn't want to receive John because he wanted to be the one that was the most important in that community. He wanted to have the accolades and the fame and all of that. That happens today. It's interesting how a 2,000-year-old letter like this one can still apply to us today. In verse 10 he says, Wherefore if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth. Prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. This is not a threat, but it's interesting. He says, I'm going to remember this guy and what he did. Not only that, it was written, and it's been remembered forever. I just wonder when this letter circulated what this may have done to Diotrephes, or how it may have affected him then. Because definitely, even to this day, we know about this instance, and he is given as an example of how not to act, to not be one that's overly concerned with having the leadership role and being in charge and letting that go to your head. He said he'll remember his deeds that he does, and prating against us with malicious words. It wasn't enough that he wouldn't receive them or let them come. In addition to that, he wouldn't. He went against them with malicious words and talking bad about them. So if you want to not allow somebody to come speak in your church, that's one thing. But then to just run your head about them is not. It's not very godly. He says, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. So the ones that wanted to receive these people, he ran them off. This must have been a big church, because if this happened in a small church, it wouldn't be a church very long. This Diotrephes fellow, number one, he wouldn't let John come. He didn't want to receive him. And then he wouldn't let any other brethren come. Then he talked bad about them, and the ones in his church who didn't like what he was doing, he threw them out. Now there have been churches like that throughout history. They don't have a leader. They've got a tyrant in the pulpit. And this happens, believe it or not. Sometimes way too much authority and power is given to the pastor. That's why I thank God I was voted in and I can be voted out. Anytime they feel like I'm not following the Lord and I'm not leading correctly, they need to vote me out. That's the way that goes. This guy apparently is not doing things correctly, and so he's remembered here. Verse 11, John says, Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God. He's basically saying with Diotrephes, the way this guy's acting shows me he's not following God, and the things he's doing is evil. And very unlikely this guy was saved. If he was extremely backslidden, because you can't act like that when you love the Lord. He says, He that doeth evil hath not seen God, which means if he's doing these things and he's not going to repent of these things, then obviously he doesn't know the Lord. Verse 12 says, and this is talking about somebody else, Demetrius hath good report of all men and of the truth itself, yea, and we also bear record, and you know that our record is true. So Demetrius, see, It's not just that one or two people think they're good. It's that the all involved agree this is a good person. You know people like that, and I do too. People in our church that it's not disputed that they're good and that they love the Lord and they're sincere and faithful. There's others that maybe there's a question mark about that we know. But there's always those that we can be sure about. And Demetrius is one of those. He has a good report of all men. Nobody had anything bad to say about him. A good report of the truth itself. And also, John says, we bear record. We know this guy. And you know that our record's true. So all men speak well of him. We speak well of him. I don't know who Demetrius was. Maybe he was a potential replacement for this Diotrephes guy. Maybe the church that John's writing about, where Gaius lives, maybe this church is splitting, and maybe they're having all these issues with this pastor. Maybe they're fixing to get rid of him, and he's recommending Demetrius. Or he's telling them about another church altogether. Or he's just reporting on things they ought to know about people they know. I don't know. I just know that these are things that are... We're not given a lot of information about who these folks are or where this even is. If John's in Ephesus, then I don't know where he's writing to or where these folks are. But it's just interesting that what we can draw from this is that these same character type people are walking among us. And this is how you're to handle them. Those that act like Diotrephes, we need to prevent from becoming leaders over us. And those like Demetrius, who probably are humble, need to be elevated to a point of leadership. He says, I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee. We shall speak face to face. Peace be unto thee. Our friends salute thee. Greet the friends by name. It's always good to remember somebody's name. I'll tell you, it makes you feel special. I was eating in a little cafe yesterday, and I was talking to a guy, and he introduced himself as Robert, and I introduced myself as Chad. Well, I made a point to call him Robert for the rest of our conversation. He kept calling me Chip, which told me he didn't hear me because he was calling me Chip and not Chad. And that's okay. I mean, it's fine. But it makes people feel good when you know their name, you remember their name, and especially our friends and our brethren, we call them by name. I think it makes people feel important when you remember who they are, when you recognize them. And people need to be elevated and lifted up like that. So in summary, the letter was to Gaius from John. He talks about how he wants to see him prosper and how he rejoices greatly because he's heard nothing but good about him. And that John talks about how great his joy is that those that he led to the Lord follow after the Lord. And he talks about how faithful they were, how they served brethren and strangers. And then he talked about how he was going to come and how he wrote to the church to ask about coming. And that he had one against him, and that that very one against him was against others of like faith and ran people out of the church who were interested in hearing what they had to say. He wanted to be the only one speaking. You got to be careful of those that want to be the only one to have anything to say, myself included. And then he goes on to talk about Demetrius. He's telling Gaius about Demetrius. And I don't know what the purpose of that is, if he was a suggested replacement, or if it was just somewhere else they could hear from, or if it was just somebody they both knew that he wanted to report on. I don't know. But he closes by speaking these things about these specific people, saying that he would come and see them soon, and wishing them peace and grace. And anyway, so while the letter in some respects is like reading someone else's mail, in one respect it's just it ought to encourage us to pay attention. It ought to help us to know what to do in these situations and what to watch for, and to remember that overall the important thing is, and I'll reread verse 11 because it applies, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good, and he that doeth good is of God, and he that doeth evil hath not seen God. Their fruits will let you know what kind of people they are, and you'll know whether or not to receive them. So anyway, that's the end of that. We'll look at Jude, Lord willing, tomorrow. Sorry that we're so late this morning. The rain prevented me from getting into my office without walking through a flood. It collects up here against the front of my office, and I don't know a way to divert that, but one of these days we're going to have to do that. Anyway, you guys have a wonderful day. We'll see you, Lord willing, tomorrow.